institutions where faith is transmitted through parish, through school, and so on. All that is beginning to disappear, and something new is emerging, which is much more about we are all members of the people of God and then divided by function. Some of us are called to different ministries. Some of us are clergy, religious, bishops. Some of us have different charisms, but we're all called to recognize those charisms and to exercise them. This was really the great sense in Rome of what was emerging. So I'm going to tell you about how it worked. I'm going to tell you about this new thing that we did in Rome, this new way of being a Synod of Bishops. I'll explain who was there, how they got to be there, and so on. And then in the last part, I'll talk about some of the things, or in the report, some of the conclusions, which I think have implications for us here. So we met in Rome, as synods of bishops always do happen in Rome, but this was a synod unlike any previous one. Synods were restored in the 1970s, and they've been going since then. This is the first time that this has involved not just bishops, but also the people of God. But before I get there, just to remind you that the Synod of Bishops that we've just had in Rome is part of a journey, a process, which you're familiar with because you've been part of it in this parish, which began in October 2021 when it was launched in Rome. And then, if you remember, we had the local or diocesan stage in which parishes, institutions came together to discuss and to discern what was in the document sent to us from Rome. The results of that, the fruits of that, were gathered into diocesan synthesis reports, which then became a national synthesis report, which I was involved in writing. And then, and by the way, quite remarkably, 118 bishops' conferences, that's to say every single bishops' conference in the world, submitted a synthesis report. That's never happened before. Before synods, when there's been a consultation, there's been about a 60% response rate. So we had a 100% response rate. And a number of us gathered in Frascati in Italy in September 2022 to read all those bishops' conference reports and do a synthesis of those reports, which was called the document for the continental stage. This is a journey always of gathering, of listening, of writing, and then synthesizing, and then going on to a new stage. So after the continental stage report was produced, there were then 7 continental assemblies earlier this year. The European one was held in Prague, but there were 7 continents. They're not actually necessarily geographical continents, but as far as Rome is concerned. So we have Europe, we have Latin America, we have Asia, Africa, Oceania, Middle East, and North America. So each of those continents held assemblies of the people of God. They were not assemblies just of bishops, but bishops, clergy, religious, and lay people. In the case of Europe, each bishops' conference was asked to send 4 delegates, and it should be a bishop, a priest, a religious, and a lay person, and please make sure they include women. So at Prague, we had a meeting of 33 bishops' conferences, 4 delegates from each. Each continent did it slightly differently. Doesn't matter. We had these 7 continental assemblies of the people of God, which took the fruits of that first stage, and then discussed and discerned, and each one of those produced a report. And then you're going to guess what happens now. Those 7 reports were synthesized into the document which began this assembly of bishops in Rome. And that document was called the Instrumentum Laboris, or the working document, which was literally a document that set out a series of very concrete and specific questions which the assembly would work through. But I just want to sort of just pause for a moment and just to stop and realize that this has never, ever happened before in the life of the church, this degree of global consultation. I think actually it may be the biggest ever consultation carried out in the history of humanity. If you think that the church is itself over 1 billion people, that it's 5,000 dioceses across the world, and almost all of those dioceses took part in this process. People say not many people actually took part in the discussions. I don't know how many took part in this parish. in England and Wales, we reckon it was something like 30 to 40,000. In the United States, 700,000, France, 200,000, Spain, 150,000. Now, as a percentage of the mass-going population, you might say that's not huge. I don't know how many percent of this parish is here tonight, but generally it's quite hard to persuade Catholics to turn out for anything if it's not Mass. And actually, these are unprecedented numbers. And so the level of participation, even though it's small, is still historically massive. So just to stop and realize that this consultation, this listening process, is the most extensive ever carried out in the church. And that the process of synthesis each time is about listening very carefully to what people have been saying and taking from them the consensuses or convergences. So where there's a kind of convergence, then the assumption is that probably this is important. But that doesn't mean it's a majority view, because also in syntheses we're also looking out for often voices that are prophetic or where there's a kind of a new horizon being shown. But the point is that where you get a convergence and it's across the church, then you have to say something important is happening. And in the case of the global stage, what was quite remarkable was how the theme of women came up constantly, in a different way in each continent, but nonetheless the theme of women. That the church needs to stand with women much better, that women's leadership needs to be recognized, the dignity of women and so on. So that has been a big theme in the church, in the process. But a whole lot of other themes as well, about clericalism, about the way in which people are called to participate, the obstacles to those participation. Anyway, all this is gathered in this process of synthesizing and discernment and so on. So we end up then at the beginning of October with the Synod of Bishops in Rome, different in its composition and its method from previous synods. Now, just to let you know how synods used to be, and I've covered many of them as a journalist. Well, actually, the first one I ever covered was in the year 2001, so quite a long time now. I've been at many synods, but not obviously inside, but covering them. And I can tell you roughly how they used to be. They've changed a little bit over time, but basically the bishops, and they were only bishops who could vote and speak in synods, would meet in the Synod Hall, which is within the Paul VI building, which is, if you've ever seen a picture of it, basically like a theatre. So the bishops are really staring at the backs of the heads of the people in front of them. They're all fairly crammed in. And the idea was that they could speak about anything they liked for the first week. Each bishop was allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes on anything they liked. And everybody basically had to listen. One cardinal said to me it was like a transatlantic flight each day, but without the movies, when you're all kind of crammed together. They were given the instrumental memorial, the working document was the draft of a document, which they then would work on in the course of the 3 weeks. After the speeches each day, they would meet in small groups to redraft the document. So a very kind of tedious, quite grueling process, which used to be also very controlled by the Vatican. So that's how it used to be. This time, it couldn't be more different. And I don't know whether you've seen pictures, but instead of being in that Synod Hall, the Aula del Sinodo, it was elsewhere in the Paul VI audience hall. Some of you may, if you've been to a papal audience in winter in Rome, you know, you're not outside, you go to the Paul VI audience hall. So they'd cleared away all the chairs in the front part of the hall, and they had 35 round tables across. Quite a sight, I can tell you. Somebody likened it to a wedding banquet style layout. And at these tables were not just bishops, but also lay people, religious, and clergy. So the three people who had never been able to take part in a synod as members before were there. Now, I'm going to give you some numbers now, because I know some of you are curious about percentages and numbers. There were 365 members of the synod, and a member is somebody who has the right to speak and to vote. Just keep that in mind, because there were other people at the synod like me who were not members. But there were 365 members. The 365th was the Pope. So 364 plus the vote. Seated at 35 tables, so that's 10 or 11 per table. And the tables were divided by language. So we had English, we had Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Different numbers. There were more English tables than Italian, but they were all divided by language. So at those tables, so 75% of the members were bishops. This is, after all, a Synod of Bishops. But 25% were non-bishops, or as they put it in the Vatican, members not endowed with the episcopal munus, which amused some people. Oh, I'm not endowed with the episcopal munus. But that means that they weren't bishops. So they might be lay people, they might be religious, men or women, or they might be priests or deacons. There was, in fact, only 2 deacons there. But there we are. So, and that's what's never happened before. Now, people have been present at synods before in different capacities, but they've never been members. Yeah? And for the first time, so obviously the media were very interested in this, and it is an important statistic, 54 of the members of the 365 were women. That's 15% of the whole membership of the synod this time were women, and this is the first time. Now, just a little slightly nerdy point here. In fact, some non-bishops have had the vote at previous synods, but they've been male heads of religious orders, okay? And usually a handful of them. At the Amazonian Synod in 2019, it was discovered that one of those heads of the religious orders was the head of an order of brothers, the Marists, who are brothers, right? And he had the vote. So some of us said, well, hang on, if ordination is not a qualification for a vote, why can't a woman religious, who is head of her order, also have the vote? And there was quite a lot of scratching of the head. And, well, we realized that that's an anomaly. And anyway, we knew that change was coming. But until it was announced in July that this composition of the synod would be 25% non-bishops and that all would have the vote, we had no idea it would be that many. Now, just to present a picture, I did have some slides, but it doesn't matter. So at the beginning of the opening mass of the synod, we all gathered. I'll tell you my role in a minute, but it doesn't matter. I'm there among them. We gathered in the Braccio del Constantino in the right-hand side of the square to process out for the opening mass. And it was quite a sight because it was lay people and religious who went at the front of the liturgical procession, yeah? as normally would happen. But certainly it was the first time I can ever remember that happening. It was quite a feeling to be moving out through the square with other lay people and religious and women and so on, to be followed then by the clergy and the bishops and so on. So the presence of the women at the synod were very important. They became known as the synod mothers, because traditionally you talked about I padri synodali, and so the synodal fathers is an expression. So they became known as the synodal mothers, and of course they were often having their own picture taken together with the Pope and so on. And it was definitely an important presence in the synod. Many of the bishops said that they behaved much better as a result of having the women there. Now, some raised the question, and it's an interesting ecclesiological question, what is the authority of the Synod of Bishops when a quarter of those who vote are not bishops? And a number of the bishops did point out, and they're right, that the bishop has a special munus, has a special charism of authority recognized by the church. And therefore, how is that authority to be exercised if they're doing so alongside people who were not bishops? And the answer from the Synod Secretariat was very, very interesting. It was a very interesting intervention from the General Secretary, Cardinal Grech, but also the Pope intervened as well on this question. And I'm not allowed to go into a lot of detail about what was said, but roughly, first of all, synods are consultative, as Father Bill pointed out in his newsletter. In other words, they're called by the Pope to advise him. They're not deliberative, they can't make decisions. So if a body is called by the Pope to advise him, the Pope can decide how that should be composed. If the Pope wants to extend, in other words, the membership to others, then he's free to do so. And that in Episcopalis Communio of 2018, which is the document now regulating synods, it does say, as long as 75% of the members are bishops, it's still a synod of bishops. But more importantly, The fact that the authority of the bishops is being exercised as part of a process which is rooted in the consultation of the people of God, the sensus fidelium, does not reduce the bishop's authority but enhances it. And this is a really important point. We have to distinguish between power and authority. So somebody might have the power to do something, to order you to do something, but their authority depends on the extent to which that authority is exercised legitimately. In other words, in consultation, having listened to people in processes of discernment. And this is a really important point. This synod, I believe, was much more important than previous synods. It has more authority because of the process that led up to it and the composition of those who were there. But here's another important point. The non-episcopal members were described in the list of participants as witnesses of the synodal journey. They were there because they had been part of the synodal processes in their countries. And just so you realize who they were, these non-episcopal members, they were delegates of the continents. So remember I told you that there were the 7 continental assemblies earlier this year. Each of those continental assemblies was asked to send 10 delegates to this synod, hence the 70. And that those 10 should be made up of, so this time no bishops, but clergy, religious and laity, men and women, and please make sure that you have some young people, they were told. So in fact, we had the youngest member of the synod was 19 years old, a guy called Wyatt from the United States, 22-year-old Polish woman. Yeah, and again, have young people at the tables was really quite striking. A few more numbers for you. Most of the members, as I told you, were bishops, sent by the bishops' conferences of the world. Depending on how big your bishops' conference was, you might have 1 or 2. In the case of Brazil, it was 5 because they're huge. Africa sent 44. The Americas sent 47. Asia, 25. Europe, 48. And Oceania, 5. And you can see immediately from these figures, this was an incredibly global gathering. Suddenly you felt at the synod that we really were part of a world church in which Europe is no longer the center. It was really striking in the synod to hear these testimonies from Asia and Africa, young, vigorous, growing churches, and indeed Latin America, which is sort of not a young church, but again, a young church. Sorry, not a young church in terms, but in terms of the people are youthful. And a very, very different set of circumstances and priorities. I remember an African bishop saying, more than one said, your priorities are not our priorities. Your churches are empty, ours are full. Your seminaries are empty, ours are full. You have the resources, we don't have the resources. Listen to us. We are the church that's now growing. I was very, very struck by that. Also, the presence of the Eastern Church is very, very important. They had a very strong voice at this synod, the voices from the East. So I've described the members who were bishops, and I've described the members who were non-bishops. There were other members as well. There were the ex officio members, meaning they were there by virtue of their office, so the heads of the curia, 20 of those, representatives of the religious orders, 10, the synod secretariat people, the synod council, and so on. There were also 52 there who were ex nominatione pontificia, meaning the Pope had picked them. The Pope had said, I want that person there. And it was kind of fascinating to go down the list and try and work out why the Pope wanted them there. Something we should be concerned about? Oh, it's a car. So it was rather fascinating to work out why the Pope wanted them there. In the case of some of the bishops, you can see that he was counterbalancing some of the bishops who had been sent by the bishops' conferences. Father Jim Martin was there, for example, was a papal pig. I don't know whether some of you know him as a Jesuit writer with a big ministry to gay people. The voice from the margins was very much in the Pope's mind. There was a spokespeople for disabled people, somebody who worked with migrants, and so on. In addition to those, there were what's called the fraternal delegates who were representing other Christian churches. From these islands, we have the Anglican Bishop of Chichester, Martin Warner, and so on. So those are all the members, okay, 365. Now, there was another odd group of people of whom I was one, and we were known as experts. I phoned my wife and I said, finally, I'm recognized. So there were two kinds of experts. There were the expert facilitators, and there were the expert theologians. I was an expert theologian. I kept putting it in inverted commas. Theologian meant somebody involved who was basically involved in the writing or the working towards the final document. So our job was to listen to everything that was said and read everything that came out of the small groups. We synthesized and we drafted. There was actually a small writing group who actually wrote the document, but we fed them stuff. So that was the theologians. And then the facilitators, there were 40 of them, and they were mostly women, were there to facilitate the small groups. They were known as small groups. These are the groups of 10, the table groups. Yeah? So their job was to make sure that they all stuck to the method. And the method was really one of the great fruits of the Synod, and I'm going to talk at length about it. But first, who was there from the UK? Team UK, just so you know, Archbishop John Wilson of Southwark and Marcus Stock of Leeds were the two bishops' conference delegates. Then we had another bishop who was the Pope's pick, Bishop Nicholas Hudson, Auxiliary of Westminster. We had a priest, Father Jan Novotny. We had, I mentioned Martin Warner, the Bishop of Chichester. And also, I should mention, one bishop from Scotland, the Bishop of Argyll. And then we had two experts from Britain, me and Anna Rowlands, Professor Anna Rowlands of Durham University. And then one more Brit, who became a very important presence in the Synod, Father Timothy Radcliffe, the Dominican writer and speaker. Now, Timothy led the members in a 3-day retreat prior to the beginning of the assembly, first time this has ever happened. And I don't know whether any of you caught anything that he said. It was all live streamed. But he was magnificent, just fantastic. And I know from talking to Timothy that he really sweated blood over these talks. He himself has been through a brutal couple of years, was unable to speak, I think, for 2 years after a terrible operation on his jaw, on his cheek, following cancer. And he described that in detail to us in one of the talks. But you really got the impression that this was Timothy Radcliffe's great moment, to shape. Well, what a moment, what a chance. So he was not only leading the retreat beforehand, but at the beginning of each module, he gave a reflection. So he was a kind of the spiritual guide for the assembly, along with an Italian Benedictine nun who was also excellent. The Pope was there most days, sitting at one of those round tables, the top table, slightly raised above the others. And if you came early each day, the session started at 8:45. If you came about 20 minutes earlier, he would usually be there. He was wheeled in his wheelchair and was happy just to chat, and you could go and have your picture taken with him and give him a hug. Wyatt, the young American guy, got him to sign a letter asking that he be excused from classes at the University of Wisconsin after he got back, because he was going to be so exhausted from the Synod, and the Pope was delighted to sign it because he's framed it, But so just having the Pope there and his presence, his availability, his accessibility was magnificent, and he intervened on a couple of occasions. One time to express his concern about the state of seminaries, the second time to give this really powerful speech which was made public about clericalism and about the people of God. So, what did they do in the small tables? Well, they worked through the working document. The working document, the Instrumentum Laboris, was divided into a series of modules which had questions. The first module, what are the characteristics from our experience of the synodal journey so far? What are the characteristics of a synodal church? Where do you see synodality being lived? And what does it come to mean to you? And then the 3 B modules were communion, mission, and participation. The communion overriding question was, how can we be more fully a sign and instrument of union with God and of the unity of all humanity? The second question was about co-responsibility in mission. How can we better share gifts and tasks in the service of the gospel? And the third one was on participation, governance, and authority. What processes, structures, and institutions are needed for a missionary synodal church? So those were the big overriding questions of each module. Each module lasted about 3 days, 3 to 4 days. But within those questions, there was a whole load of other questions for discernment, and these were on worksheets. So each group worked through a very long list of questions for discernment in each module. And how did it work? So I've explained that in each group there was a facilitator. The facilitator was not a member of the synod, but appointed by the Secretariat to facilitate the group. But then the group was asked also to elect or appoint 2 people. One was the secretary, whose job obviously it was to take notes, and the other person was the rapporteur, whose task it was to report the fruits of each group to the wider assembly. So each group you've got 10, it was usually about 11 different people. And the method that they followed was one that you may already be familiar with, called conversation in the Spirit. Now this method, I think, has emerged as the synodal method par excellence. In other words, if we are to learn to be a synodal church, we need a way of gathering and deliberating and discerning together. We need a method. We need a disciplined method that allows us to do that. One that begins in prayer, but also allows full participation and deep listening. So this is the method that has emerged, and it was laid out very clearly for the members, and during the retreat prior to the assembly, they practiced it so that they were familiar with it by the time it began. I'm just going to try and summarize it. You begin, first of all, with silence and prayer. So we actually began each day with a reading from the Word of God. So the group didn't begin with the Word, but began in silence. And the idea was that you have thought beforehand about the question of the module. Yeah. And then, in the first round, everybody speaks for 4 minutes, and they're allowed to say whatever they like, to speak absolutely from the heart, up to 4 minutes. And nobody responds or discusses. You just listen, one after the other, going round the circle. And you're being asked not to respond, but to become aware of the resonances in your own heart of what you are hearing. And then there's a further period of silence while you reflect on that. And then in round 2, you again go around each person in turn, this time for 3 minutes, in which you share what has impacted you from what you've heard, how it makes you feel, what you sense, what you've become aware of in listening to everybody else. Then a further period of silence, and then a third stage in which the facilitator then encouraged people to have a freer discussion about what had emerged, and then to move gradually into trying to draw it all together to say, okay, where do we agree? Where is the convergence in the group? Where do we sense consensus, unanimity means everybody agrees. Consensus is like what from the group emerges as the principal thing which we are uniting around. But also, where are the divergences? Where do we disagree, or where is there tension between our positions? And then thirdly, what are the steps that we need to take, or that we think need to be taken, to develop, deepen, or clarify what we've discussed? So that each group was asked to do that. So you can imagine this takes quite a long time. And then having done that, and the secretary's made the notes, the rapporteur then reads the fruits of their group to the whole assembly. So you imagine 35, they had 3 minutes to do this. So 35 3-minute summaries of the fruits of each one. Then people were allowed to respond individually. They could ask for the floor they had a tablet like this, they could ask to speak, and they were automatically queued. And then they could speak to that module or that question, okay? And the idea was that the groups then listened to all of this, and then the next morning they regathered in their groups to rewrite or reconsider their report in the light of what they've heard, and then they have to agree it, vote on it, and then they sent it into the Secretariat. At that point, we, the experts, read them. Quite an elaborate process, and a very kind of intense process. And I wasn't part of a small group, but you can imagine I had endless conversations with people who were in the coffee breaks and so on. And people described it as kind of incredibly transformative, because this method means you can't just simply try to persuade anybody of anything. It's not a debate, it's not a discussion. It really is, what is the Spirit saying to us? In the final report, they described its practice as eliciting joy, awe, and gratitude. And I would say that's right, talking to people. That it's a path of renewal that transforms individuals, groups, and the church. Yeah? That conversion is at play. Now, many people said, I was converted in this process to understanding why people believe what they believe. Or I listened to a bishop from X or Y, and it completely transformed. I realized in their context, that makes complete sense. So you might not agree with the person that you're listening to, but you understand why they're saying what they're saying. And more importantly, you begin to understand where the Spirit is at work. Now, this also can be work in a negative sense. For example, the topic of women's accession to the diaconate, as you know, came up as a theme. And one cardinal said to me, and he was a very kind of open-minded cardinal who was very, open to that question. But he said, there was somebody in my group who was, she was giving us all the biblical justifications for the diaconate and trying to kind of persuade us of this. And of course, that produced in other people the reaction of, okay, well, those are biblical reasons, but what about tradition? So you become aware that where people are pushing an agenda, or they're trying to kind of impose something, that you become aware of that, or when they're simply trying to block something. So you start to become aware, if you like, of power plays, that people, we all do it, we all do it, right? You become aware of these little power plays. And that makes you realize, well, actually, that's what causes division. That's what disrupts communion. And on the other hand, you become aware of when people are offering their own experience or insights as a gift to be shared rather than a view to be imposed. Then it starts to become a sort of a rich process where everybody's views go into this mix together, and you start to see new horizons opening up. So it was really, really important in this process, as you can imagine, for a lot of bishops to listen, for example, to young people or women. And by the way, there were some very interesting moments of tension and so on, and some very funny moments. There was the odd getting up from the group in a huff. There was the odd, of course, as you can imagine. And some of the bishops, I kind of felt for them, actually, because particularly for some of those, and I better be careful, but from parts of the world where, if you like, the bishop is a rather regal figure, the idea that they were just one among equals was hard for them. It was an existential displacement, but a good one. And so, but again, I spoke to bishops who said, gosh, it's been beautiful, that I have just been one of the group, and I've learned so much from this. And generally, I would say the bishops really, really liked the method, and they really liked the composition, but above all, the method. So I wanted just to share this with you about the conversation in the Spirit, because I know many of you will be saying, well, how is this relevant to us? I think what's going to happen now is that this conversation in the Spirit will become the method which we're, in a way, all invited to embrace in our meetings in the parish, in the deanery, in the diocese, and so on. Because it's actually about the purification, if I can just go a bit deeper for a moment, it's about the purification of intention. When we engage in a discussion about something, what is our intention? What are we hoping to achieve? What are we pushing, and so on? So, if you like, this method uncovers those motivations, and we all have them in ourselves. It's important that we realize them too, so that we begin to get some greater clarity about what builds communion and what undermines it. So, what happened in Rome was a kind of synodality boot camp, where we learnt these things, and people came away really, really changed by that experience. In a way, I think we're all invited to do that in the church more and more. When we're asking ourselves, for example, what is the Spirit asking here of this parish now in Epsom at this time? Where are we being called to be? What are we being called to be as a community? What are we being called to do and be? Rather than having a business meeting, so many people said this, we need to get away from this corporate business meeting idea. We are the church. We are the people of God, summoned with Christ at the center, summoned by the Spirit. The processes by which we make decisions need to be spiritual. Of course, they involve business. They involve practical decisions. but they need to begin with discernment and the deep listening to the Word of God. I spoke, by the way, to one archbishop, Canadian, who told me in his diocese they don't have a single meeting now, which at any level, parish, diocesan, that does not begin with 20 minutes of Lectio Divina, of listening to the Word of God. He does not allow it. You're not allowed to have another kind of meeting. And he says it's been transformative. It has transformed the life of the local church. So let me now just bring this to a bit more of a conclusion by pointing to the synthesis document which emerged. I'm not going to try and summarize it because it's 40 pages long and you can download it in PDF. If other of you speak other languages, it's available in loads of different languages. Synod, synod.va. Just download it from there. And I really do urge you to listen to it. It's divided into 3 parts. The face of the synodal church, all disciples, all missionaries, and the third part is called Weaving Bonds and Building Communities. Just a few things from the report I want to draw your attention to, where I sensed real movement in the synod. The first was the recognition that the church has the power to create ministries. Yeah, the ministries are not simply handed down to us and been there at all time. Throughout its history, the church has changed and altered its ministries according to the needs of the time. To put this another way, it's not that the church has a mission, the mission has a church. The mission comes first. And if the mission therefore demands that we rejig our ministries, that was an important realization in the assembly. And just to quote from the document, before any distinction of charisms and ministries, we are all baptized by one Spirit into one body, Corinthians. Among the baptized, there is genuine equality of dignity and a common responsibility for mission according to the vocation of each. And that synodal processes enhance this gift. Synodal processes, in other words, make real that truth that we are all called and we are all called to exercise those ministries. So in the whole section on mission, called co-responsibility for mission, what's understood in the document is that every Christian is a mission on this earth, as Francis says in Evangelii Gaudium. That the lay faithful, all the people of God, contribute in a vital way to advancing that mission. And it's not just lay people are there to evangelize the world, you know, the secular world as it's sometimes called. I've never quite understood that expression, the secular world. But rather also in the life of the church. Yeah. The lay faithful also live out ministries within the church and to assist the church. So how can the faithful be better recognized and understood as exercising their vocation? And it says very clearly in the document, and this was absolutely what happened in the assembly, that increasingly the church is coming to depend on, whatever you want to call them, catechists, lay ecclesial ministers, and active lay people, let's call them, who are more and more carrying out functions and ministries which might traditionally have been reserved to the priesthood or indeed to religious. This is true now, and it will, of course, become more and more true. One very interesting proposal in the document is when it's talking about establishing ministries according to the needs of local churches, to develop the ministry of lector, which, as you know, Francis has put a lot of emphasis on. And I'll read you exactly what it says here. One can think of further expanding responsibilities assigned to the existing ministry of lector, responsibilities that are already broader than those performed in the liturgy. This could become a fuller ministry of the Word of God, which in appropriate context could also include preaching. Okay? It's there as a line, and it's there as a proposal to be worked on, to be considered. But it seems to me that opens a tremendous door. There's a lot, as you can imagine, about the relationship of the sacrament of the holy orders and the non-ordained, that whole question. A whole section on the accountability of a bishop, that we need structures and processes for regular review of the bishop's performance. Now, I'm sure that doesn't mean simply kind of performance review, but rather structures in each diocese where the bishop can better hear from the faithful about how he's doing, but about how the diocese is doing. In other words, diocesan pastoral councils and the like. And it all mentions these structures. And then one other thing which happened in the synod, which I thought was very important, was what's called the digital mission. Sorry, I've used up nearly my hour here. The digital mission. We became aware in the synod that there was a group of people who have become known through the synod who have a presence online accompanying people. For example, Sister Shiskia Valladares, who's a Spanish nun who gave a testimony at the synod, a Spanish nun in Palma de Mallorca. She has 700,000 followers on TikTok, 700,000. She takes wonderful little videos, and she just shares her life. And people love her, and they talk to her, and they ask her questions. And she shared something of that with the assembly. People say, how can I find God? How can I find my way back to the church? Often people very alienated from the church. But here's the thing. You know that the synod in our diocese, time and time again, I read all the reports, and they're like, where are the young people, right? I mean, it's what you're asking yourself all the time. Where are they even tonight, right? What's happened? The faith transmission has broken down. And it's almost like the synod started off by saying, where are the young people? And then the digital missionaries are saying, it's okay, we know where they are. We found them, they're online. And they live in a different place. It's a culture. It has its own language, its own way of thinking. So as a result of the synod, because there was a whole project to listen to people online to contribute to the synod. 150,000 people ended up taking part. And as a result of that, they become aware of this network of people who have been doing this for years on their own without real recognition and support from the church. So that is one of it has a whole section in the report. But again, one of those fruits of the assembly. But generally, there is so much in the report, particularly in the last part, about how we can begin as a church to introduce decision-making processes and discernment processes at every level of the church, which start with listening, deep listening to everybody. Consult, listen, find out what's out there. Start with reality and with experience, just like in the Council of Jerusalem. Don't start with ideas, start with experience. What are people living through? And then ask yourself, what is it that the Spirit is calling us to? Us here now, in this place. What are we being called to? And how do we discover that? Through conversation in the Spirit, which allows us to enter into communion with each other. And in a world which is increasingly fractured and polarized and spilling out into war, where our democracies, we no longer know how to speak to each other, where politics has become a pure power game, what we did in Rome was important. It felt significant and prophetic in our time. That synodality is not just for the church, it's for the whole of humanity. So we have a year now before next October, and the question is, what do we do now? Well, we're going to have, at some point, directions from Rome, from the Secretariat. But what I want to just suggest to you is that you can pick up that document tonight. Don't wait till tomorrow. Tonight, you can download it. Pray about it, read through it, and look at what it comes up with. Look at the proposals. Look at also the divergences, and begin to discuss among ourselves some of what does this produce in me, and what are our answers to some of these questions? Because I can tell you that the Synod really wants to hear now from the local church. We're not trying to redo the Synod. It's all there in the document. There are proposals. There are something like 80 proposals, calls for commissions and all kinds of things. And many of them involve lofty experts and so on, but many of them can be done now, like the one I just mentioned about extending the ministry of lector. Are there people among you who feel called to be a lector to preach? Not obviously at Mass, but are there other contexts in which you might be invited to preach? Do it, and then write about it, report it, tell Rome about it, and then next October, hopefully there will be all these experiences over the year of how these proposals have been put into action, and that can then form the basis for the last part of the discernment next year. It's been great to be with you. Thank you very much. Delighted now to take questions for as long as you want. Over to you. Sorry to take so much of your time. I meant to finish a quarter of an hour ago, but Very happy, by the way, for you to say whatever you like, ask whatever you like. If you're going to share an opinion or a view, I suggest the synodal discipline of no more than 2 minutes each.
You made a lot of emphasis on the numbers of people that were involved in this. It seems to me that that is a false premise, because the original information was coming from a handful of what you might call usual suspects in parishes, where you weren't getting a real cross-section, and that's inevitable. But I remember when I listened to your talk that you didn't give because you couldn't come last time, and you said that the Holy Father was very concerned that some parishes were sending out questionnaires rather than actually getting people together. And I don't understand why a questionnaire wouldn't actually have gained more information than this. I mean, I don't know what, you didn't tell us I don't think you told us, what percentage of Catholics worldwide were actually represented in that.
Okay, got it. Just the last question, nobody knows. Nobody knows. I read most of the Bishops' Conference reports. Some of them gave some estimate of numbers. Most of them gave none. They gave an impression of the levels of participation, but it was never quantified. So we don't know. I gave you some figures which I do know. I told you France, Spain, US, and so on. As a percentage of the mass-going population, my own estimate in Europe is it's something around between 6 and 8% of the mass-going population. Is it a lot? Well, depends how you look at it. It's unprecedented level of participation. And remember that we were just beginning in this process. People didn't know what this was. So I think the fact that we had so many turn out, I mean, you claim that it was a sort of self-selecting, unrepresentative group. All the evidence that I've seen suggests that what we had in those diocesan reports pretty much matched what we know about what Catholics feel about most things. There's no indication that the people who didn't take part differed much from what was in them. So I dispute that. And then your final point about saying, well, there wasn't many in Rome. Well, 450 people, 365 members. But if you look at where they were drawn from and how they came to be there, I would say that it was a pretty remarkable slice of the leadership of the Catholic Church across the world. And again, they were supposed to come with the experience of their own synodal processes and their own discernment. So they weren't coming just with individual views, but having listened very carefully. So, it's not supposed to be a kind of democratic process where views are represented. It's not a democracy. It's not a parliament. It's a discernment process. And I think within the human limitations, they did pretty well. Thank you.
Thank you for a very illuminating talk and an insight into what's gone on in the last 3 weeks and could be of profound importance for us as a church going forward. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's what happens next. We were structured from 2001. There was a document to discuss. Parishes sat down and talked about that. I've read the 41 pages. There isn't really an awful lot in there that gives a direction as to how the body of the lay faithful is going to be engaged in the next part of this exercise.
I agree.
For what is going to be the outcomes of all of those wonderful observations and recommendations that are in that 41 pages. What's your own view as to how that should work? And is there anything in your understanding and vibes from that meeting as to whether there is going to be another structured process that's going to capture all of that?
Yes, there will be. I did mention this, but not very much. The Secretariat of the Synod is at the moment drawing up a document which I think will be sent to every diocese with suggestions for how concretely the local church can now engage the document. And I know this because they've been consulting people who have told me that they've been consulted. So I don't know when it's going to appear, but yes, something will appear. But I actually think if you look at the document, a lot of it there's no need to wait for Rome, to give directions, because those are questions and a lot of proposals there, which we can begin to implement now in our parishes and in our dioceses. And I do want to so you're saying, what's my own view of this? And I'm speaking with no authority here, except that I know that this is the feeling of a lot of people involved in the synod. The way the church grows and develops is, this wonderful Latin phrase, ad experimentum. I mean, the Pope loves this. He's always setting up bodies ad experimentum. In other words, let's see how it goes. It's not yet official, and yet within the realm of in the unofficial space, it can go ahead. And then we will see how it develops. And that's why I think there's a lot of things in the report which can be done, even though they may not yet be in canon law, but they can be done, and then the experience reflected on, and the experience then shared with Rome and with the synod participants. And I think the hope and the expectation is that when they gather, well, not next October, but there will be a new working document probably in the summer of next year, which should contain a lot of this stuff that's been happening in the local churches, experience, which they will then be asked to reflect on, as well as conclusions of various commissions and so on. So I think I know this is a bit vague, but look at the document and see what strikes you, and see, well, what can be done and developed. Certainly, every deanery, every parish should have. By the way, one of the suggestions is there should be a mandatory pastoral council in every parish, as there now is in Rome, as there now is in, for example, the Diocese of Newark. Oh gosh, is there one here? Oh, there isn't one here. Oh dear. Sorry about that. There we go. Mandatory diocesan pastoral council, which is not just a business meeting. It is there to help the pastor discern the mission of the parish and the future of the parish. So mandatory, but also mandatory diocesan pastoral councils. Every diocese should have one. The idea. So these things can happen. They can happen soon. You don't need to wait for orders or directions for any of this to happen. So my suggestion would be read the document, see what strikes you, and if you're moved to want to do something, I know it would be of great help to the synod process if you just did it and then reflected on it and let people know about it. Just wait for the microphone.
A year is a very limited space of time.
Very.
And for this synodal process to be the success that we all hope it's going to be, it strikes me there's a huge amount of work that could be done between now and next October. Well, I guess that's just a comment, really.
No, I agree. I agree.
It just strikes me that we've really got to get on with it quite quickly.
Absolutely. And I don't think a year is very long at all.
No.
Particularly given that if they want to draw up the working document by next summer, they probably need a lot of proposals and conclusions by March, April. Yeah. Actually, that's how the synod has felt all along. I don't know whether it's felt like this to you. There's never been enough time, really, ever. It always feels like but people who are really experienced in these processes say in a way, that's quite good. You need to feel a certain pressure and stress, an urgency, because even though the Spirit works over time, the kairos and everything, there's also the chronos. There's the time of now, the urgency of now. The climate crisis is real, the fragmentation war is real. This is all happening now. The questions facing our church are just going to get urgent with each day. So in other words, we need a sort of a healthy sense of urgency as well. Yeah, thank you for that.
Austen, thank you very much for coming here this evening. It was lovely to hear from somebody that actually was present at the synod, all the experiences that you had there. We hear a lot on the media, but it's always good to hear it from somebody who actually witnessed it. So some of the critique that has come out about the Synod is that actually the Synod is a meeting to learn how to have meetings. And quite frankly, from what you described here to us this evening, that's the impression I have too. It was very much a gathering, a global gathering nonetheless, but a gathering to learn how to have meetings. And now, quite frankly, I think that at parish level, at our own experiences in pastoral life, in catechesis and evangelization, if we don't stop to pray and preach Christ crucified and risen, we'll get nowhere. That's just a comment. Thank you.
Obviously, I agree with that last part, and that's why every day of the Synod we began with the Word of God, and it was all about the centrality of Christ, and it was all about the centrality of the mission. So the idea that that there's some sort of opposition or tension between the proclamation and the centrality of Christ and synodality, I reject any kind of idea that they're in any way. This is all about putting Christ at the center and being on mission and hearing where the Spirit is calling the church, which is precisely the mission of Christ. The meetings about meetings thing, there's part of me which understands what you're saying. We all have a horror of interminable meetings. I know I do. I'm terrible at meetings. But it wasn't a meeting about meetings. It was a synodality boot camp. It was a place where we were learning not to try to settle our differences too soon. Because, look, let me put it like this. Let me take an example which will be familiar to you. And I hope I don't create an ecumenical problem here. But the Church of England has a parliamentary system of resolving differences. They don't resolve the differences. They settle the differences just as our parliament does by means of a vote. We have two parties, one against, one for, one wins, the other loses. The differences are never overcome or transcended. They deepen, in fact, over time. And so what you get is a progressive fragmentation of the body. Catholic synodality operates through consensus. It's all about building and learning where the consensus is. And the consensus is the fruit of the Spirit, but you can only know that over time. So you need patience. The kind of majorities we had at the Second Vatican Council, 98% majorities, is what we've just had now. And I can tell you that in the assembly there were incredible divergences of views, real differences, and yet the assembly voted for every single paragraph. It was mostly 95, 97, 98%. Only 3 paragraphs on the accession of women to the diaconate did it attract significant opposition, but never more than 20%. That is consensus, and it is remarkable. It's almost as if we were saying to the church, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, imagine even the question of homosexuality, we couldn't even agree on the term LGBT, right? There's huge differences, and yet we chose to walk this path together as one body, as one church, which means that we have to displace ourselves. We have to learn to listen to the other. We have to learn that it's not about me or my view. It's about where we're being called to, which is beyond all of us. Now, learning that is not easy, and it takes time. So it's not a meeting about meetings. It's learning how to listen to the Spirit as it forms us into a body, so that we learn that there is a wisdom that transcends all of us, that's greater than us, that we need to open ourselves to.
I'd like to thank you as well very much, and also just say that I had the opportunity to read this afternoon what you wrote in the tablet, which is very much a lot of what you've said this evening.
Yes, sorry about
and
that.
I recommend it to anybody who can get hold of a copy to read it, who can't remember exactly what you said. But I found it really enlightening. And I think what's come to me is that the process, we can say, it's a meeting about how to have a meeting, but the process was so different to anything I think our church has experienced before. I mean, I was first married at the time of the Second Vatican Council, which was so exciting, and the windows were opened, and we thought everything was going to change overnight. To an extent it did. You know, we had the Mass in the vernacular, etc. And then we had the National Pastoral Congress, which happened in 1980. That's 40-odd years ago, and I was there. And I was on the section co-responsibility, which seems to be the key word at the moment. And I think, gosh, in 40 years, has that really happened? We've had parish councils, pastoral councils, diocesan councils, but those seem to have faded, unfortunately, and it's become a more clerically centred church, I believe. And so this new process, I think, is really exciting. And if we can sort of image that within our parishes, I think that is going to be the way forward.
Thank you very much.
So I hope we can do
No,
that. We need a lot of energy, I think, to get it done.
But I'm very struck by what you say, that in a way you were doing this, you know, in 1980 with the National Pastoral Congress, and then it kind of what happened. And there is that sense. I mean, sometimes, you know, the church, things don't happen for a time, and then they, in the next generation, they reappear, and suddenly they make sense, or they're real in a way that they couldn't have been. And you know, this isn't the moment to analyse why synodality didn't take off in the 1980s, but it really is now.
Yes. I just pray that the new process will encourage my children and my grandchildren to want to be active members of the church.
Thank you. And just on the question of young people, because it comes up a lot, you know, one of the things that I think we need to learn is to listen to young people. Instead of asking, what do we do wrong? You know, find out, because in my experience of talking to young people, they haven't rejected the church, they haven't rejected faith, but they don't see the point of the institution, of the liturgy. But we have to listen, and we have to accompany them. We have to learn, in fact, to listen to everybody. We have to, rather than waiting for people to come to church, they're not going to come. You know, we have to go out and listen. We need to enter into the new Galilee of our time. That's how we will make it into the new era. The church has gone through these periods before in history of rapid change, and it's always come through them by deep listening to where the Spirit, where Jesus is going out before us in Galilee. But it'll be out there that we find where the church is reborn in our time, as it is across the world already. I was very struck in Rome. You know, we lament so much. We have a picture of decline and shrinking here, but really, as a world church, that's not true. The church is growing all over the world, and some marvelous life is happening across the world. And we need to learn from that as well and listen to that. Good. Oh.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your talk. I've had the impression that this synodal process is very much a result of the prophetic vision of Pope Francis. Given the age of our Pope and the frailty, do you have confidence that there is enough momentum in the synodal process that will survive him, that we won't be looking back in 10 years' time and saying, well, that was a nice thought?
Yeah. It's a great question, and one that a lot of people are asking, not least because he is 87, and a lot of comparisons are being made to John the 23rd, who, of course, opened the Vatican Council but didn't live to see it through. I'm confident that this is a genie that will not go back into the bottle now, and that, you know, it's not suddenly happened. This is the outgrowth of a whole process in Latin America, which Francis was part of. Synodality, in a way, produced him. And this latest, the Synod on Synodality, is happening 10 years into his pontificate. He's been preparing the ground, the way that the Synod of Bishops has changed itself in the last 10 years. The bishops have come to see more and more the importance of the Synod as a process of ecclesial discernment. So I sensed, and again, the majorities I read out at the beginning, you know, the document begins with this statement that synodality is the future of the church. That got, you know, 300 and, you know, whatever it was, votes versus 11. So yeah, there is a clear majority of the bishops are really, really fully behind this. And here's a thought to perhaps that we could almost sort of end with. The next conclave, whenever it happens, if it happened next year or it happened the year after, will take place against the background of this historic, unprecedented consultation of the people of God. And I want to suggest that any incoming pope, any new pope, cannot ignore this process and the fruits of it. If you've had a process like this of deep listening to the Spirit, it's going to profoundly shape the way you see your pontificate, or indeed the way you go about electing a pope. So I think this process will transform. So it's not just will the next pope want to be synodal. I think synodality will transform the next pope.
Thank you. Thank you again for your talk. I just wanted to mention, because you've brought up a few times, and you've brought up the Holy Father mentioned it, the problem of clericalism. I was wondering if there's been any mention at all, maybe this is something more for the future, about making sure the opposite doesn't happen with the laity. Especially, I think it's a reality that needs to be more considered, is that the laity get nowhere near, the average laity, the preparation that the clergy do in terms of theological formation. So yes, that's it. I was just wondering.
Yeah. So, okay, it's really important to understand that the document is in no way opposed to the priesthood. This is not against the priesthood, far from it. It's all about how the priesthood can be better lived in a life in which we are all called to ministry. So we're not talking about replacing the priesthood. The priesthood is a fundamental part of the Catholic Church. It's like the Eucharist, it's like the papacy. These are non-negotiables. Yeah? So the involvement of the laity in the life and the mission of the Church doesn't in any way undermine, but rather enhances the ministry of the priesthood. Okay.
Thank you very much, Austen, for your talk. And I was aware that as you were talking, I was feeling tremendous, well, I suppose a joy that this way of being church is coming into the fore. I'm a member of a religious community, and I've had the privilege of being a delegate to our chapters. And I'd say for the last 4 to 5 chapters at least, we've entered into a similar way of proceeding, a communal discernment, which I think is very similar. It's perhaps differs slightly in parts of the process, but very similar. And I think the way that we are, as a community, are transformed by participating in the process is quite striking, and I can just resonate with so much of what you're describing and saying. So I would just encourage people to take on this this challenge, but it's also a tremendous opportunity and one that is very graced. So please do take it up. And at that question, what is the Spirit saying to us in Epsom, to this parish here and now, that's a vital question. Yeah, so thank you.
Just very quickly on the chapter meetings, in many ways, synodality is taking the experience of the chapter tradition of the religious orders. So not for the first time the religious orders are kind of coming to the rescue of the diocesan church. And it's very interesting in the preparation for this, how much the religious orders were able to share about their own processes. Chapter meeting is described, by the way, in chapter 3 of the Rule of St. Benedict. The abbot listens to everyone in the community, pays special attention to the youngest among, because sometimes the Spirit speaks through, the youngest and most inexperienced, and then takes the decision, but everybody having been involved in the making of the decision. This is really important. Thank you.
You may be interested that certain lay organisations already involved. I was privileged to be at Buenos Aires for the World CLC meeting. I went to the Visitors' Day at Amiens, and as member of the Formation and Retreat team, attended at Manresa last year, a very similar process. I can warn you, you are wiped out afterwards.
Yes.
And that was in spite of the fact that, for example, at Manresa, we went round on the Cardoma River for reflection and up on the roof of Manresa House in Spain. So you've got to be prepared.
Yeah.
It changes your life.
Thank you very much. I was in Buenos Aires with you, of course, for that meeting.
Yes, I know.
So I remember it very well. Yes, don't underestimate how grueling and how intense these processes are, but they are transformative. Thank you very much for your testimony. I think might be time for a glass of wine.
Don't take my thunder. I'd like to thank you very much, Austen, for coming all the way from Hereford to spend the day with me and giving this wonderful lecture. We've learnt a great deal. I think that the wind of change is something you talked about, and how it was all going to happen was all a mystery to us, and I think you've thrown some really good light on it. I really enjoyed your description of the actual process. It reminded me very much of my own Teams meetings. So that's very good. But I'd like to thank you in a more positive way.
Oh.
So a little
Thank you. Thank you so much.
thing for you.
Thanks so much, Phil.
I'd like to invite everybody to come to the back of the hall. I brought some, back of into the narthex, to be precise. I think you've all spotted it anyway. So we've got some wine for you and a few nibbles. And Austen will be there, and he's quite happy to continue answering your questions, as long as you give him a chance to get some liquid in his throat first. But I'd like to invite you all to give a final
Thank you so much. Thank you.
applause.
Thank you very much.